Okay, we are recording.
Excellent. So thank you for coming, everyone, today. We're really happy to put this off. I am just going to do a little introduction. My name is Sarah Ferber. I'm the program manager at Food First NL. And I've had the pleasure to connect with these MUN School of Social Work students that we're going to have presenting today. So Emily, Taylor, and Madison are joining us from the course Social Work Knowledge and Skills for Community Development. And so as part of that course, they had to do a community service learning project. And they contacted Food First NL because they were interested in doing something related to food. So we were really glad that they thought of us. And that's the first time that we've partnered with students on a project like this in their program. So that's a great opportunity for us. And we did a bit of brainstorming in our team and thought that we would like to have more information about the intersection of food security and food insecurity with mental health. We have been interested over the years in developing some resources around that topic, but it hasn't come together yet because of, the stars just not aligning with our work. But it is something that's been on the brainstorming table for a while. So having these students do this background research for us as a lit review is really helpful. And we'll be able to take this information and then hopefully develop it further over time. After today, if anyone on the call has any questions or comments about it, the person to contact on our team is Suzanne Hawkins. And you can reach her at suzanne@foodfirstnl.ca. And maybe Danica, you could put her email in the chat for me if you don't mind. Yeah, so she's your follow-up person. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Madison, Taylor, and Emily. They're going to introduce themselves and then take us through a presentation for about 45 minutes. And then there'll be some time for some questions afterwards if you would like to ask them. So thank you very much. Take it away, folks.
Thank you, Sarah. So my name is Madison, and I'm a fourth-year social work student at the MUN School of Social Work.
And I'm Taylor. I'm also a fourth-year student at Memorial University School of Social Work.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. My name is Emily. I'm in the second degree program of social work at MUN with Taylor and Madison. Yeah, so we're in the same classes right now, but they'll graduate before me, and hopefully I'll be able to meet up with them again at some point.
Yeah, so we are really excited to be able to put off this webinar today. As Sarah said, this is kind of like a new area of research, the intersection of food insecurity and security and mental health. So just a bit about our project that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to give you a brief overview of the three-step project process that we had, and then we're going to review some of the key findings and some programs that we found and our recommendations. So in terms of our project, what we had to do for our class and for Sarah was we had to kind of review the published research that's out there and look at different programs around the world that look at food security and how mental health kind of intersects with food insecurity as well. So for the three different parts of our project and the goals that we had, the first part had us looking at different groups of people that you would find, such as people who are experiencing homelessness, children, different Indigenous communities, and how food insecurity affects their mental health and how the two kind of influence each other. For the second part of the project, we looked at various food programs around the world, as I mentioned, that focused on food security specifically. So programs that worked on things such as food literacy skills, gardening programs, and how they impacted people's mental health in a positive way. And then our third section that we'll get to at the end was based on our recommendations that the three of us came up with as a group after our research was complete. Oh, Emily, we can't hear you.
Yes, I'm on mute again. That's going to be a struggle for me today. Okay, so to start off our presentation, we wanted to give some definitions of food insecurity, food security, and mental health. So Taylor's going to cover mental health now in a second, but I'm going to do food insecurity and security. According to Food First NL, food insecurity can be defined as experiencing financial difficulties when it comes to buying and keeping food in your household. Food insecurity can affect anyone at any time, regardless of your employment status. So it's something that everyone should be aware of and everyone should be knowledgeable of. Food security, on the contrary, means that all people at all times have physical and economic access to adequate amounts of nutritious, safe, and culturally appropriate food to maintain a healthy and active life.
Okay, and so one thing we wanted to make clear was an understanding of mental health, because everybody experiences mental health and it's on a continuum. So throughout your life, everybody experiences poor and good mental health, and that does not necessarily mean that you have a mental illness, and this mental health impacts everybody, and so everybody should be concerned with this topic, because everybody's impacted by food and everybody experiences mental health. So we are going to be talking about the risk and protective factors throughout this presentation. A protective factor is something or someone that can help you through a tough situation, such as a strong family or a secure job. And a risk factor would be something that makes it harder for you to handle this situation, such as domestic violence or living with substance use. So those are just some examples there, but so just something to keep in mind, that you can experience mental health challenges without having a diagnosis.
So before we get into it, we just wanted to give you all a broad overview of some food insecurity facts in regards to Canada. So what we found in the research was that generally 1 in 8 Canadian households is food insecure. So this means that they may not have enough food to last them to the next paycheck, or they aren't eating enough due to those financial challenges that we just discussed. In terms of our own province, St. John's is actually the most food insecure city or metropolitan area in the country, with 1 in 6 households being food insecure. And this alone kind of highlights why food insecurity is so important to research for our province. Really, anyone that you know within your social circles could be experiencing food insecurity. And with the high rates of it, especially in the province, I can see why it would be such an important area of research.
So just before we get into the key findings, I'm just going to give you guys kind of an overview of the populations or groups of people that are more at risk. So food insecurity rates are significantly higher in households that find themselves falling below the poverty line, are composed of racial or ethnic minorities, households with individuals who live with physical or mental disabilities, along with households headed by single mothers, those who rent rather than own their own home, and those that actually rely on government-based assistance programs versus being fully financially independent on their own through their own work. Research that we did showed a significant correlation between mental health and food insecurity. And the more chronic the health concern, the higher the risk for food insecurity. So that would be talking about the diagnosed side of mental illness. If you had a severe diagnosis, then you are at higher risk. So the potential for individuals living with one of these risk factors could also be increased if there is like an intersecting amount of risk factors, so meaning that they might experience more than one, and that would also increase the rate of which they might experience food insecurity. And also we found that experiencing food insecurity can further impede existing health concerns that somebody might have, which can place them into a cycle. So another thing that I wanted to note is that if you're experiencing mental health concerns, especially in conjunction with food insecurity, several of the research highlighted that those people can also struggle to then maintain basic self-care to improve their situation. And that can also contribute to long-term mental health challenges, as well as long-term food insecurity, which not only impacts the children, or sorry, the adults, but can have an impact on the children that are in that household as well, which perpetuates the cycle of the health concerns and of being food insecure within that family. So throughout the following slides, we're going to highlight some key findings regarding mental health and food security in relation to groups and people and communities, certain types of maybe disorders and children. And then Madison is actually going to highlight how some of these findings play into our healthcare system. So first, we're going to talk about food insecurity and mood disorders. So mood disorders were probably the most prevalent among mental health challenges that are connected to food insecurity. So food insecurity among those with mental health challenges, such as mood disorders, are significantly at higher risk than those with without that added mental health challenge, despite having similar social and economic relationships. And mood disorders are among the most common mental health challenges I just mentioned, and those experiencing it reported lower income levels, which again contributes to being food insecure. And the studies that we reviewed showed increased feelings of depression related to these financial struggles. So again, an added layer of mental health concern. A concerning finding that we found was the relationship between being food insecure, not getting the proper nutrition, and increased mania symptoms. So this is something I really wanted to note because there is a connection between the food that we eat and the biochemistry that's happening in our brain. However, we are just highlighting this because there is a correlation that we found, but we don't have the expertise to go into that any further, really to understand the research. But we wanted to make it known that it does go past the social aspect, and there is a biological aspect to it as well, because the nutrition can affect your mood and brain chemistry. I also believe that there are people that are doing research on how food interacts with different medications that individuals with mental illness may be on, and how that would impact their daily life, and how food programs that would educate them could be helpful there. So that's something that's related to mental illness diagnoses, but we won't be going further into that because we just don't have the proper background to be able to give you guys the proper knowledge on that. So individuals living with mood disorders who participate in the studies we reviewed experienced higher rates of food insecurity kind of across the board. And now I'm going to talk about an added layer that comes in with this that was kind of highlighted throughout research when it came to mood disorders. It was kind of like an added layer. So food insecurity among those with mood disorders is associated between mental health challenges and food insecurity, but then there's the added layer of substance use. So being food insecure can place people at higher risks for stress and mental health challenges, which can place them at risk for substance use. And a study was actually done in British Columbia, which was exploring these associations with individuals who self-reported living with lifelong substance use. And substance use was found to have to be higher in those who also recently experienced mood disorders. And lifetime substance use has had a significant association with experiencing food insecurity. So as you can see on the slide here, there's a triangle happening between all three of them, and there's a causal relationship between each of these points. So now I'm going to move on and talk about a specific population. So mood disorders and depression and anxiety are the most prevalent mental health concerns when talking about women. And so I'm going to talk about a specific case that I read because it touched on a lot of overlapping themes that I found throughout all of the research. So we're going to, for this purpose of this talk, we're going to talk about low-income women in a rural community. So 47% of women who experience food insecurity also experience anxiety and mood disorders, as I mentioned. And the research done on women living in rural areas has shown a significant association between income and depression levels, along with a causal relationship between the waves of depression that they may experience and the food insecurity that they may be experiencing at that time. So this is meaning when these women are experiencing worse mental health or poor mental health, as we discussed, because it's on a continuum, then they are more likely to experience increased food insecurity at those times. But when they're experiencing better periods of mental health, then their food insecurity is not as severe. And oftentimes experiencing levels of poverty, such as being low income because perhaps there's a lack of employment in your community, is impacting the mental health of the person and also their ability to purchase food. So there is an interesting additional component that we need to consider when we look at individuals living in a rural community. Residents in rural areas experience inflated food prices, not all the time, but it is something that needs to be considered. And I know in our province, it is a reality, especially for people living in Labrador. They also have more limited access to programs that would address their mental health concerns, limited access to programs that would help them with their income, their food concerns, and they just face a lot more barriers when it comes to transportation, which is further isolating them from these services that they may need. As many of you who live in Newfoundland may be aware, we do not have the best transportation system, and the further outside the main city you go, the more evident this becomes. I know in Labrador, when I was there, they didn't have really a transportation system. It was fully reliant on taxis, which again can be quite expensive. So it's just something to consider. Moving on. So next, I'm going to talk about food insecurity in Indigenous communities. I know we're covering a lot here, but we did cover a lot in the research, so we're just highlighting a few groups. So I'm going to talk about a national study that was done on First Nation communities in Canada. There were Newfoundland groups included in this, but it was a national study. So they described food insecurity as an urgent public health issue for First Nations communities, and it's associated with various negative outcomes that impact them throughout their entire lifespan. So roughly 20% of First Nations adults reported struggling to meet their basic food needs periodically throughout the year, in addition to struggling to meet their other needs, such as paying for utilities, clothes, transportation, childcare, and not to mention that many of these communities do not have safe drinking water. Additionally, nearly 60% of First Nations adults reported chronic health challenges, and 33% of youth reported chronic health issues as well, with mood disorders and anxiety being among the most prevalent concerns in these communities. The First Nations communities have been impacted similarly to other Indigenous peoples in our country by residential schools. For those of you who may not know what residential schools are, Indigenous children were taken away from their family and placed in Catholic-based or the church-based schools across the country, and were stripped of their cultural identity, language, and their ties with their own culture were and family were broken. And a lot of them experienced abuse. And I won't go too much further into that because that's not what the presentation's on, but it did cause significant trauma. And these traumatic experiences have had an impact on the overall mental well-being of individuals and families. So it has not only affected the people that attended residential schools, but it also has impacted their children and their children's children and thus, or so forth. So when this study was done, they considered the correlation between food insecurity, health, and well-being, and they used a food security index, and they found that those who actually attended residential schools or had family members that had attended residential schools that were kind of the head of the household were experiencing severe food insecurity when compared to those who did not. So many Indigenous communities are also located in rural areas. So we also need to consider those similar barriers that we discussed in the previous slide, on top of not being able to access culturally appropriate services, appropriate food for their culture, and transportation to maybe access that food and so forth. So the final one that I'm going to talk about before I pass it over to Madison to talk about children is food insecurity with university students. This was a topic that just kept popping up when I was doing the research. So I said, okay, it's worth mentioning. And roughly 40% of university students face food insecurity or at risk for becoming food insecure. Students experiencing food insecurity generally report poor mental health, such as experiencing really high stress levels, anxiety, and depression. And these students also demonstrated lower GPAs when compared to students who were food secure, sorry. Each of these factors directly correlates to one another, and it's kind of forms a triangle between GPA, which having a low GPA was related to feelings of shame and self-doubt, and then experiencing high stress levels and the pressure to maintain your school, anxiety and depression, and then becoming food insecure also plays into that. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, ethnic and racial minorities are at higher risk, and that is no exception for students. Those who are part of an ethnic and racial minorities are at higher risk for food insecurity among students, along with those who experiencing housing instability and maybe rely on financial assistance programs. So there were several themes that contributed to food insecurity among students. So I have some of them listed here on the slide. So firstly, students face the reality of increased cost of living, along with student debts and tuition and instability in housing and support resources. Secondly, there's time constraints of balancing work and school and other commitments. So several students reported that they don't even have time to sleep, let alone seek out food that they can afford that is healthy, or learning how to prepare food, because several of them would be moving out for the first time on their own, and this would be the first time they would need to consider how they were going to feed themselves and prepare food on their own. And third, students who are no longer living at home were unable to access culturally appropriate foods, and that left them feeling more isolated than again, which contributes to their overall mental health. And one thing that was noted is that universities on the campus are increasing the food prices. So they are experiencing inflated food costs on campus, and oftentimes university students don't have access to vehicles, and so they're kind of limited on where they are able to get their food. And so they're forced to kind of pay a higher fee for the food that is available on campus. And that again is limited, and so there's a concern with the nutrition again there. And so the lack of transportation also needs to be considered with students, as it is not only impeding their access to grocery stores, but also their access to work opportunities, mental health services, and things that they could kind of get that would maybe make their situation better. So these barriers to accessing food, along with the financial strain and being food insecure, has resulted in physical and mental health challenges for university students.
So throughout our research, something that came up in almost all of the studies that we found was something related to children, relating to children and food insecurity, and there's a lot of concerns about their mental health as well. A big thing in terms of children that people are concerned about is their overall development, their healthy development, and their emotional well-being. So a few of the things that we found throughout the research on children specifically was their awareness of food insecurity trade-offs, which I'll explain in a second. As I said, their overall healthy development, and the connection to other risk factors that we mentioned earlier. So echoed in a few of the studies that I looked at was the fact that children are very aware of how their caregivers are feeling. Children are a lot smarter than some people may think that they are. Children can tell when their caregivers are stressed or anxious. And in one study in particular, talked about how caregivers may have a tendency to try and hide food insecurity from their children. So they may try and hide that they don't have enough food for all of them, or that they're feeding their kids, but the caregivers themselves may be skipping meals to do so. But children, especially in the ones in the study, and shown to actually understand what is going on and actively try to keep food in their themselves by either eating less or skipping meals as well. And this was really important for us to highlight because obviously having an awareness of that is crucial for children as as trying to find a way to work with the kids and managing their anxiety levels is important, especially for their emotional well-being, and making sure that they have enough nutrition. And then something else that we wanted to touch on was the children's experiences of food insecurity and the connections to other risk factors. So as Taylor showed with her diagram, with children, it would look like children and food insecurity, and maybe their experiences with homelessness, maybe themselves and their caregivers, having domestic violence in the home, having a caregiver who may use substances, and then being involved in the child welfare system. So all of these are actually risk factors that can put them at a higher risk of experiencing prolonged food insecurity. And then going off of that, in terms of their development, for children who do experience this chronic food insecurity, they're actually more likely to be underemployed, undereducated, and experience food insecurity with their own children as they grow older. So one really interesting study that I looked at was how these childhood experiences shape their development as they grow. So this is another reason why researching food insecurity and working around ways to help people be more food secure is so important, because it really does create that cycle of people experiencing food insecurity as children, and then that kind of following them as they grow up and throughout their life course. And then I wanted to note the concept of trade-offs, which I think really goes back to children being aware of what's happening in their home. Trade-offs are described or were described by caregivers in a study that I looked at as having to choose between paying rent or covering medical bills, because it was a study that was done in the States, and other expenses as well, or feeding themselves or feeding their children. So the concept of trade-off is really important, especially in the study that noted it, because when children are aware of what's going on in their home, they can tell, my parent is, especially if they are experiencing, maybe their light bills are getting cut off, or their heat, and they are noticing, like my caregiver is stressed about this. So obviously they're having to choose between one or the other, and that contributes to both poor caregiver mental health and poor child mental health as well. So the stress of all these things that I mentioned are really noticed by children and adolescents as well, and can contribute to lifelong experiences with anxiety and or depression. And then just to kind of bring it all together, one of the things that Sarah wanted us to look at was the overall cost on Canada's healthcare system in regards to both food insecurity and mental health, and how the two of them really work together in a negative way to really impact people's health and well-being. So we have a little, my little diagram that I did here. So for food insecurity, mental health, and Canada's healthcare system, there is a significant relationship between people who experience food insecurity and an increase in the use of mental health services. So there's a relationship, a general one, between food insecurity and a higher use of health services overall. But one study that I looked at found that food insecurity was a predictor for acute care hospitalization, longer stays in acute care, and higher odds of having to have a same-day surgery. In terms of actual costs, I think there was one that looked at Ontario specifically. It was found that over the past 12 months at the time of the study, the average cost for acute care for someone who is food secure, so who had enough to eat, who always had enough nutritious food, was around $1,200 throughout the year. And then so this increased by at least $400 depending on how food insecure an adult was. And then the other study that I looked at found that the relationship between food insecurity, there was a relationship between experiencing food insecurity, and having a higher chance of the adult in question experiencing mood and anxiety disorders, depression, and then the odds increases as the severity of the food insecurity goes up. So a key finding that we put into this graph here was that 40% of individuals living in households with severe food insecurity had received treatment in the past 12 months for mental health reasons, compared to 15% of adults who were living in food secure households. So the mental health treatment could look like seeing a general practitioner, accessing, say, like a crisis line, having a stay in a hospital. So that's a big increase, and it's all directly related to the food insecurity that these adults experience.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about food security programs in support of mental health. Basically, my job was to look and see if I could find any programs or initiatives that focus on food security and have actual positive mental health outcomes. So yeah, that's kind of what I focused on. So first, I'm going to give a summary of benefits of food-based programs. So various studies have revealed that there are numerous benefits to food-based programs outside of providing nutritional food to the community. For example, there was one study that it was just a literature review of a bunch of other findings from different programs and initiatives, that regular involvement in horticultural therapy, community food growing projects, and community gardens can significantly improve mental health and well-being. For example, Involvement in these activities has contributed to a reduction in episodes of stress and associated depression. Regular involvement in horticultural therapy has also alleviated symptoms of dementia, such as agitation and aggression, as well as distress associated with cancer, end of life circumstances, grief, and illness, which I think is a major thing to highlight there. Alleviating symptoms of actual physical illness and the mental, like when you're physically ill, there are mental effects and side effects of that. So I think that's important to notice that it's helpful in both aspects. People who live with a substance use disorder have also shared that community food growing projects have been a positive social activity for them that provides emotional and social support, which I think is another big thing to talk about as well. And next, I'm going to talk about food-based programs in Canada. So I wanted to compare the different programs that are available in Canada and the ones that are in around the globe. So the first one is there's Community Food Centers Canada. So basically, I just went through their website. I saw some different documents that they have published, and this is a summary of my findings in terms of food security programs and positive mental health outcomes. So Community Food Centers Canada is an organization that has established multiple initiatives that have addressed food insecurity, low income, and overall well-being in Canada. In Perth, Ontario, Community Food Centers Canada has a program known as Shovel and Spoon. I love that name, which is a workshop series for groups of low income or marginalized youth and adults. So throughout the series, like throughout that program, when you're enrolled, individuals can learn about and also grow, cook, and share healthy food with others. The purpose of Shovel and Spoon is to reduce isolation amongst the community, especially for marginalized and low-income groups, engage the community in both cooking and gardening projects, and increase knowledge of healthy eating and living. So something that I liked about Shovel and Spoon is that even though it is an educating program, it's the main purpose of it is to reduce isolation amongst the community. So these groups, marginalized and low-income groups, social support is also very important to address, as well as food insecurity. So I like how they mixed the two. And I think it's kind of cool how they not only do they teach them how to grow their own food and all that kind of stuff, but they take them from the very beginning of how to grow it all the way to how to cook it and how to prepare it. So I think that's kind of cool that they take them from beginning to end, and how to recognize healthy food and what you should include in your diet. On to the next project is Global Roots Gardening. So Community Food Centers Canada has also partnered with the Canadian Mental Health Association for initiatives including the Global Roots Gardening Program. So I wanted to note this one as well because they actually partnered with the Canadian Mental Health Association, which is really cool. So the Global Roots Gardening Program targets older adults and newcomers from diverse cultural backgrounds, as they are typically the groups with the highest levels of social isolation in Canada. The purpose of this program is to bring various cultures together to create community gardens that represent food from each culture represented in the group and the community. Global Roots has shown increased socialization amongst members in these groups and within the community overall, increased overall mental health, and a sense of community amongst the older adults and newcomers in the program. Involvement in community gardening, cooking programs, and community kitchens can improve the social skills, and that's what Global Roots has and Shovel and Spoon have addressed. They have actually helped decrease stress and increase social capital for those with mental health issues facing low income and or a member of marginalized groups. I think I love the idea of the Global Roots Gardening Program because for me, when I was reading about it, I can just visualize populations of older adults mixing with newcomers in Canada. And basically the older adults are there teaching about our culture and our food and welcoming them into our country. And then we also have the newcomers in Canada. Not only are they learning about Canada, but they're also educating us on their culture. And I think it's just so good and for increasing diversity and also just making people feel welcome. So I love that idea, that program. And next, I'm going to talk about food-based programs from around the globe. The first one is Health Lit for Kids. So the number of articles I found talking about children, as we mentioned earlier, is like, it's such a huge population that they're trying to target. And I love this one because it's based on educating the children on the importance of healthy living and healthy eating. So it's a program in Australia that targets primary and elementary school children by raising awareness of health literacy. Health literacy refers to an empowerment strategy to increase individuals' control over their own health, their ability to seek out information, and their ability to take responsibility for healthy eating in their home, community, and workplace. Health Lit for Kids was designed to encourage community between children, parents, teachers, and caregivers. This program developed new approaches for teachers to incorporate health literacy in their classroom through posters, just open discussion, pamphlets, and different initiatives for recess and lunch eating and that kind of stuff. And it also encouraged schools to embrace overall healthy living and eating for their students. So the different foods that the school would provide for the students, that was also promoted as well to be more healthy. So the majority of parents of children involved in Health Lit for Kids, because there was a study where the parents of these children would be interviewed and questioned about the different effects that Health Lit for Kids has made in their children's lives. So these parents indicated that their children developed a tendency to act on health-related knowledge at home by requesting healthier foods and more physical activity in their free time. So the kids are actually absorbing this material and they are applying it to their own life, and they're taking it seriously. Parents also indicated that the overall mental health and well-being of their child improved throughout the Health Lit for Kids program. So my understanding, this was my understanding before I read the author's understanding as well, is that the empowerment to make their own health decisions and education on how to live a healthy lifestyle may have played a role in the greater quality of mental health in children. So when kids, this is just from my own knowledge, but when kids are like, when they know something, they want to apply it. When they are good at something, they want to do it. So I think what's neat about this program is that they're empowering kids to not only know about the healthy foods, but to voice that and to have a say in that. So I think that program is really cool, where it's starting young. It's teaching kids, okay, this is what you deserve when it comes to healthy eating. This is what consists of a healthy diet, and all that kind of stuff. So it's starting young and teaching kids the value of healthy eating and food security and all that kind of stuff. So another example of a food-based program with positive mental health outcomes is a community garden in Port Melbourne, Australia. I couldn't find the name of it. It just said a community garden in Port Melbourne, Australia. So the community garden, it aimed to provide an opportunity for community members to gather together, socialize, exercise in nature, and produce food for the community. Members of this community garden participated in a qualitative research study. So a qualitative meaning it's just their own feedback, their own words. It's not actual statistics or measurements or anything like that. And it investigated the perceived health and well-being benefits associated with their involvement in the community garden. The findings of this study revealed that not only did members of the community garden feel confident in the food they were growing and eating and providing for the community, but they also felt as though the time spent gardening improved overall well-being. For example, their involvement in the community garden fostered feelings of social connectedness, support from the community, and a sense of achievement. So similar to the Global Roots program, it starts with the very beginning, and they're confident. They know that, okay, I have seen this produce from the very beginning, from seed all the way to now I can trust that this is healthy food. I know that this is healthy for me and it's safe for me to eat. So I think that's also good to highlight as well. And then when they're working together, they're together. That's the key word. So um, yeah, so no matter what background or what different lifestyle they have, like they were all able to come together and have that social connectedness, which I know Taylor mentioned that mental health is on a spectrum. So even people without a mental illness per se, they were all able to come together and just have an overall improvement in their mental health, which I think is something that even if you have good mental health, you should still take care of that and work on that. So that's what this program really focused on, was just being there for people. Members also indicated that they felt as though the community garden served as a stress-free, relaxing, and therapeutic environment for those who experience stress and anxiety in their day-to-day life. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool to note as well. And on to our recommendations.
Okay, guys, so we, as we said, came up with a pile of recommendations. So we're each going to talk about one, and then we'll move on to question period. So much of the research that we saw included a recommendation section, and our group brainstormed to create a number of our own for this presentation and to present to Food First NL. So those who experience mental health challenges are not only at risk for being food insecure, but also struggle with daily skills such as meal preparation. With Food First NL's reputation as a leader in interdisciplinary projects, it could be interesting to consider engaging with mental health professionals and adding a food-based education program into mental health programs that already exist in our province. The aim would be to work on improving mental health while also building the food preparation skills that some people may be lacking. This could take the form of a community kitchen space where individuals are provided with a space and utilities to be able to prepare their food in a supportive and social environment so that they have access to a space which they may not already have, and they have guidance and can connect with people on a more social level, which will reduce the isolation that some people feel perhaps. And then further for university students who are a cohort that is, the literature showed to be prevalent with food insecurity, could potentially benefit from a program designed to give them this education and the skills that they need to prepare healthy food. In addition, programs like this could be designed to foster self-determination and tackle those feelings of shame individuals feel around being food insecure by allowing the program to be designed, opened by and operated by individuals in the community. One thing with being, food insecure and experiencing severity is people may turn to see food banks and different things like that, and that although it's a great service, can foster feelings of shame. So kind of trying to focus on giving people back their self-determination around food could be something that could be implemented into programs.
Yeah, and then for the ones that I came up with, a lot of what was reiterated throughout, I feel like all the research that we did, our conversations with Sarah and other members of Food Personnel, is that food insecurity, as we described, really is about not having enough money, having those financial concerns around being able to afford food and having access to it. So in terms of children and child mental health, something that they recommended was a change in policy. So policy implementation that took a 2-generation approach. So policy that looked at not just children and not their caregivers, but the two of them at the same time, and that this could be beneficial. So one of the studies that I looked at talked about supportive housing and affordable supportive housing, more diverse and comprehensive mental health support, and a big one was affordable childcare. And I think that really goes back to the trade-offs that I talked about, having to choose between a good daycare or good childcare for your children, or being able to put food on the table. And then, as we talked about, a main point that again has been highlighted by Food First NL would be direct government action in the form of an increased livable wage. So if people have enough money to afford all of the necessities of being a person and having a family, then severe food insecurity would hopefully be alleviated at least a little bit. As long as people are able to afford food, that needs to come from having enough money. So having a high minimum wage would help families and individuals meet their most immediate needs, such as having adequate nutritious food available, being able to afford rent, being able to afford heat and light, childcare. And while a family focused policy change could actually help bridge some of the gaps that we highlighted. And then in terms of the cost on Canada's healthcare system, both authors of the studies that I looked at talked about the need for stronger preventative measures, such as a comprehensive national public medication insurance program, universal basic income, which could go hand in hand with a higher living wage, and the responsibility of practitioners to both recognize the signs of food insecurity in the patients and the people that they're working with, and being knowledgeable in how they can assist the people that they work with in, I guess, living with the food insecurity that they're experiencing, or helping them not be as severely food insecure. But as I said, a lot of that does go back to the universal basic income and a higher living wage.
Okay, so I'm also going to talk about food education programs. I think that they are a good thing that we should be implementing, or if not, drawing more attention to. They teach community members about healthy eating. They teach food skills. Growing your own produce would also be beneficial. Such programs would educate individuals on how to best manage their food and in turn increase their food security. I remember back when we had one of our first conversations with Sarah, we asked how can people improve their own food security, and she said learning how to grow their own food. So I think that's a good thing of just reiterating the importance of that. Not only do they address the nutritional value, but such programs also foster feelings of empowerment for those who depend on services for food security. So not only are they just going and picking up food, they are going and they're kind of taking it into their own hands, literally, by putting in that work. They're gardening, they're learning. So I think it's more empowering than feeling like, oh, I am dependent on something. It's more of a community-based activity for them. Furthermore, community gardens have been shown to be successful in both Canada and Australia based on the suggestions I found earlier. Initiating more community gardens, or just drawing more attention to the ones we already have in Newfoundland and Labrador, could have the potential to not only address food security and provide fresh produce to the community, but also encourage that social connection that we've been talking about. Community gardens can encourage community members to socialize while improving food security and foster those feelings of success and achievement, further decreasing the levels of isolation that individuals feel, and could improve their overall happiness and mental well-being, which is the goal. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. Food education programs and community-based gardens, drawing more attention to those. And yeah, I think they're very beneficial.
And that is the end of our presentation. So thank you everyone for listening. And now in the few minutes that we have left, I guess we can open it up for some questions.
Thank you so much, Madison, Emily, and Taylor, for that presentation. And like you said, there's so much content and you reviewed so many sources, so it's really hard to fit it in our time period. And so Danica did put Suzanne's email in the chat. So if anyone has any follow-up questions or comments, they can also reach out to Suzanne with Food First NL. And if you have any questions for Madison, Emily, and Taylor, then you can put those in the chat now, and Danica will help to facilitate that in the chat. But we do recognize your time and that we said we would close up at 2 o'clock. So it's just a couple minutes to that now. If you have questions, go ahead, or if not, feel free to drop off as you need to. And Danica, I think we'll stop the recording now.
So